The topic of the keynote speech, the end of colonialism, a new shared future for humanity, would perhaps not be properly understood except that we take the actual context of the impending United Nations Assembly, which is happening at a time where the United States, once again, is being induced to participate in a war not of the making, not in the interest, not important to the intent of the spirit of the United States Constitution. And I'm speaking here about the possibility of the United States being induced to participate in an action against the nation of Syria, a sovereign nation which is cooperating in every way it can, both with Russia and where it can with the United States, to not only avert war, but to eliminate the very enemies of the United States that perpetrated or were part of the perpetrating of the actions that occurred 17 years ago with 9/11. But there's a deeper way to look at, I think, the present moment. The presidency of the United States has, over the course of the past 50 years, rarely been free of the control of financial and oligarchical forces, largely centered in London, that have induced the United States to go to war. But there was a time when the American presidency rejected that, and that was during the period of the first Reagan administration, when the economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche and his wife Helga Zepp-LaRouche were engaged in a set of back-channel negotiations with the then Soviet government on behalf of the United States. In the context of those discussions, Helga Zepp-LaRouche also made the observation at that time that it were far better to create a form of institution that would allow the best of humanity to be celebrated among the world's nations within the domain of culture. And the Schiller Institute, I don't know that many people know this, was originally something that was actually proposed to the United States government as a way for that government to access a new dimension, a new power, to think about the way in which it could be a leader in the cultural field rather than merely in the military or in the field of economics as people had normally thought of it. It's important to recognize that it was Helga Zepp-LaRouche who introduced many of us in the United States, at least, to the figure Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, a 15th century giant who was also the founder of the modern concepts of science and technology, but who was instrumental in attempting to heal the rift between East and West at the 1439 Council of Florence that he brought together. That outlook, which is a higher outlook than trying to appeal to merely stopping war out of the pragmatic needs of economic advantage, is something that Helga introduced to the United States. And when the United States government rejected the proposal that the Schiller Institute be an actual governmental organization as such, it was formed independently in 1984 over the period between June and November, 34 years ago. Where we stand right now, today, is that the American presidency, once again, is attempting, in the personage of Donald Trump, to reject war. And specifically war with Russia, war with China, or frankly, war with anyone. But again, forces, outside forces, seek to impact and influence, and then perhaps even seduce that presidency to take actions against the interests of the United States. So we are called upon again to play the role that we played during that period of the 1980s. And we are involved here at today in this conference in attempting to make that the case. We begin with music because we believe that it is in the higher principles of classical composition, including as in the plays of the poet Friedrich Schiller. It is in that realm that the actual ideas, the conceptions of mankind that are required for the human race to elevate itself, to take advantage of the moment that we are in, are located. And so, importantly, I'd like to just say as a personal note on this question of the end of colonialism, there's a recent conference in China involving 54 African heads of state. And in response to that conference, Helga made the observation that what we are seeing right now in the form of that conference and the subsequent actions is the end of colonialism. This is an aspiration that has been not only that of the African people, but of the world for a very long time. By eliminating that form of evil, of imperialism, colonialism, and the racialist and other theories that rationalize it, the world enters, perhaps for the first time, its adulthood. But it can only do that if the ideas and the conceptions that give the dignity of man a new meaning and purpose in the eyes of particularly young people are communicated in a profound way that allows them to see the image of their own faces in the policies and the options that now stand before humanity. And I don't think there's a person on the planet more qualified to convey that hope, that optimism, and that clarity than our keynote speaker, Helga Zepp-LaRouche.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of the Schiller Institute. I think we are to be conscious about the historical moment in which we find ourselves. Because I don't think I'm exaggerating it when I'm saying that, you know, from the standpoint of what Friedrich Schiller would call history, universal history, having arrived at what he calls in the drama a punctum saliens. What he means by that is that the development of an entire history, universal history, or in the drama, the plot comes to the point where all the options up to that point are exhausted. And it's a dramatic moment where it depends entirely on the moral character of the main actor or the main figure on stage if the drama acts as a tragedy or if it has the potential to lead to a better period. And I think from the standpoint of universal history, if you take the entire many millions of years, but especially naturally the last 10,000, 20,000 years, the last 100 years, I think we are reaching such a point in history where, as my husband, Lyndon LaRouche, has said many times, the outcome of this historical period is entirely due to the moral character of the people, where the question is posed, does mankind have the moral fitness to survive or not? So the certain leading forces are right now in a position to implement solutions, because the solutions to the crisis are existent. But, you know, is it going to be that the people of America, the people of Europe, the people of other continents are giving the kind of support to these leaders to implement this? Well, just to give a panorama, because this is a little bit different than what you would get from the mainstream media in the United States or Western Europe, for that matter. You have right now an unprecedented coincidence of existential crises. You have, as Dennis just mentioned, the immediate danger of an escalation of crisis and confrontation with Russia. Now, there have been warnings in the last weeks that put out by the Russian government that they have evidence that a third false flag chemical attack is being prepared in Syria, where they have footage, film footage of white helmets and other terrorists bringing in poison gas, sarin, and other chemical weapons, and they have crews of the white helmets ready to film such a massacre. American TV crews have moved into the region of Idlib, and basically this is all happening at a moment when the Syrians, with support of the Russian Air Force, are trying to take out the last resort of the terrorists, the al-Nusra, the ISIS, the successors of al-Qaeda, who have all gathered in Idlib. And the Syrian government is making use of its sovereign right to reconquer that last province of Syria. And the Russians are helping with the air support. Now, so the idea is basically to have this false flag chemical attack, have film crews filming it, then this goes around the world. And basically, this is all supported by a British mercenary organization called Olive. They are sitting with 5,000 mercenaries in Abu Dhabi, and they are orchestrating this operation. And you know, the various forces in the United States, the British government, the French, have already declared that they are ready to act with a military strike the moment such proof of a chemical attack by the Assad government is being presented, and that they are ready to go for a military strike. Now, the German Defense Ministry has already met to develop contingency plans for German participation, and this time not just having air reconnaissance, but use tornadoes to bomb military installations. And the scientific service of the German parliament just put out an expertise saying this is a complete violation of international law because there is no UN Security Council decision, and it's a complete violation against the German Grundgesetz, which forbids war of aggression. In light of the German history, a very noteworthy clause. So obviously, this would be, if it would happen, the first time after the Second World War that Germany would take the risk of a direct military confrontation with Russia. Now, if Trump, who is obviously under permanent bombardment of the people who are trying to make a coup against him with the aim to impeach him and get him out of office, if they would succeed to lure President Trump into a full-fledged attack, then obviously this conflict has the potential to go out of control. What happens if this US, British, French, potentially German military strikes hit some Russian targets in Syria? Would the Russians be content and not react? Well, you have right now a huge amassing of Russian Navy in the Mediterranean. You have 36 Russian Navy ships. You have British, US Navy ships exercising. And basically, instead of denouncing this whole accusations of the British against Syria and actually against Russia in the Skripal affair, they have basically shown their consent to participate that. Now you have to see the Skripal affair in this context. You know, the British have not presented one iota of proof that it was Russia who did the attempt on the Skripal and his daughter and also the other two individuals later on. The British government just said we have full confidence, the British and German government just said they have full confidence in the British assessment that indeed it was two GRU military intelligence agents, but they gave no proof of this. Now you have to look at the other pre-war scenario which is being orchestrated. And I know I'm probably stepping on some people's toes when I'm saying this, but if you look at the way how the funeral of McCain was celebrated and orchestrated in a Hollywood-style spectacular event, you know, as if McCain would be the hero of America, the patriot at the time when Trump is, you know, somewhere not fit for the White House, at least according to the media. Well, the international audience knows McCain very well because he would appear once a year at the Munich Security Conference and be one of the worst warmongers in his tirades against Russia, against China, and so forth. So basically, you have an orchestration where the Woodward book, basically portraying President Trump as not fit for the White House, as being, you know, just totally unable and giving arguments to the Democrats to go for the 25th Amendment. And then you have the anonymous op-ed in the New York Times, basically saying there are moles in the administration who are trying to undo all these dangerous things Trump is trying to do. Even Obama had to come out and say, whoever this mole is has no democratic legitimacy because whoever that is was not elected, and they have no point to try to determine the policy of the United States. But you know, there are also some voices who say it was the New York Times themselves who wrote that, which is the more likely proposition. So Obama, in this context, you know, came back fully on stage and said, is it so difficult, this was in Chicago, is it so difficult to denounce the Nazis, referring to Trump not condemning the Charlottesville incident of a year ago, totally leaving out of the picture that it was his administration who helped the Nazi coup in Kiev to bring the Nazis back in power in the Ukraine. And this was just in the same day when the Speaker of the House of the Rada in the parliament in Ukraine basically demanded a direct democracy in Ukraine in the tradition of Adolf Hitler. So that much for this attack on the Nazis. So what you have right now, and you know, when you come from the outside, you see it more clearly. You have the mainstream media in the United States gearing up a pre-war hysteria, preparing the population that Putin is a demon, that Xi Jinping is a autocratic dictator, that Trump is not fit for office. So the question you have to ask yourself is, where is this supposed to lead to? Are you putting all of this out just for fun and then you stop? Or is there some intention behind it? Now, looking at the military situation in Syria, it is very clear that since President Putin intervened militarily in Syria since 2015, Syria and Russia are completely controlling the airspace in Syria. And basically, the story is for the terrorists in Idlib that either they capitulate and give themselves in, or they will be killed. So, therefore, you know, basically, the situation is on a complete trigger point. Note the fact that Trump so far has not initiated any war. He has promised in the election campaign that he would try to improve the relationship with Russia. He has gone out of his way to develop a personal friendship with President Xi Jinping. And basically, unlike the Bush administration and the Obama administration, who have started several wars, that, you know, basically, it is also very clear that, you know, right now we are in a countdown where there is not one iota of doubt that the faction of the British Empire, which includes the British government, the Democrats, and the neocons in the Republican Party, are trying to do everything not to allow Trump to fulfill his election promise. Especially after the historic summit in Helsinki, where Trump met Putin and even recently said that this was one of the best meetings he had ever, and all hell broke loose after this occurred, there is absolutely clear that this faction does not want to allow Trump to move on this policy. All of these things I described, the Syria attack planned, the Skripal orchestration, the Woodwork book, the New York Times ad, these are all atmospherics to try, to get Trump out of office one way or another. So we are really back at a situation where this faction is risking a preventive nuclear war to occur. It's what Truman did in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and basically for which there was no military reason because the Japanese had capitulated already, and the bombing of these two cities was just to establish the reign of nuclear terror for the control of the post-war period. Now, the difference is that to that time of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, that the nuclear arsenals of the United States and Russia are big enough to annihilate the human species several times over. President Putin announced on the 1st of March that Russia has developed new weapon systems based on new physical principles. For example, a Mach 20 hypersonic missile, which is highly maneuverable, which is not following ballistic rules, nuclear-powered cruise missile, nuclear-powered submarine, which can go high speed. And he also announced, and that has been verified by various military experts in the meantime, that these new weapons by Russia will basically undo the entire anti-ballistic missile system which the United States has been building in the last year, of which Russia has said many times that they will not and cannot allow phase 3 and 4 to be built because it would completely destroy the strategic balance to the disadvantage of Russia. So obviously Russia has moved against that by developing these new weapon systems. Now, at the same time, today, you have the Vostok 218 military exercise, which started on Tuesday, in the far east of Russia. It's the largest military exercise since 1981, since the Soviet Union. It involves 300,000 Russian troops, including 6,000 airborne troops, over 1,000 warplanes, helicopters, drones, 36,000 pieces of armor, 80 combat and support ships. It involves the North Sea Fleet in the Arctic, and it is testing the capability of Russia to militarily move rapidly over long distances and coordinate between the different branches of the military. The new thing about this, apart from the size, is that it involves for the first time 3,200 Chinese troops, 900 Chinese combat vehicles, 30 aircraft, and in this way demonstrating a full-fledged military alliance between China and Russia. And also Mongolian troops are participating. So it is clear that Russia and China are coordinating their weapon systems and their command structures. I think it's a very clear signal to the war party in the West what they have to deal with in case they risk the provocation. Now, there is a German official, the former Deputy Defense Secretary of the Kohl administration, whose name is Willy Wimmer, who is still a member of the Christian Democratic Party. And he has put out in the last 10 days several warnings saying that between the next war and us all, which will annihilate mankind, only stands Donald Trump. And you may think about Trump whatever you want. I think on that point, he is absolutely right. Because if the Democrats would succeed to impeach Trump following the midterm election, I think we would very clearly see a convergence of the war party in this direction. So we have less than 2 months till the 6th of November, and the situation in the United States is already extremely polarized. When you talk to people, they're either for Trump or against Trump, and you can't have a rational discussion. Why? If you ask an anti-Trump person, why are you anti-Trump? He's a dictator. If you say, but he wants to have peace with Russia, yeah, that's because he likes dictators, namely Putin. You know, so all rationality has disappeared. And you know, obviously, the historic hysteria has reached a total point of, you know, total escalation. Now, what did people say after the historic breakthrough of the Singapore meeting, where Trump very successfully put the question of solving the North Korea crisis on the track of a solution? You know, that Trump likes dictators, and that's why he's doing these things with Kim Jong-un. Now, what you have in the United States right now is a complete groupthink, or rather a group non-think, because people are not thinking about the long-term universal history, but they're completely brainwashed by the media narratives. So if you ask people, why is Putin a dictator? After all, he was 3 times democratically elected. He has 80% of his population backing him up. So why is he a dictator? Then you hear he annexed the Crimea. Well, that is not exactly what happened, because just recently, declassified documents at the George Washington University National Security Archives were published, and they show very clearly that the Soviet Union and then Russia in the period of 89, 90, 91 was given absolute assurances that there was no intention to expand NATO eastward. And these documents make very clear that there was a conscious effort to mislead the Soviet Union and Russia about the intention of NATO to do exactly that. Gorbachev at that point received assurances that NATO would not expand past East Germany, and therefore Gorbachev agreed to the German unification. There were written memorandums to this effect, and there's a speech by the former NATO General Secretary Werner from the 17th of May 1990 in Brussels, where he said, quote, it is absolutely a fact that we will not move the NATO army outside of German territory. And this is giving the Soviet Union absolute security guarantees so that they can agree to the German unification. There are quotes and documents that Secretary of State Baker wrote to Gorbachev on the 9th of February 1990, and this is a famous quote: NATO will not expand 1 inch eastward. And that is, you know, why the Soviet Union dissolved peacefully without using tanks. They agreed to German unification, and that is why today the Russians are extremely upset about the treason of the Germans, because, you know, they agreed peacefully to the German unification, and now the Germans are about to, to participate in such provocations against Russia, including military maneuvers where the Bundeswehr is now at the Russian border in the Baltic countries, you know, something which anybody who has a sense of what happened in the Second World War between Germany and Russia should never have happened again. So instead of not moving 1 inch eastward, you have a long history which started instead of regime change, of color revolution, changing the governments of Eastern Europe, and then finally the speech of Tony Blair, 1999 in Chicago, where he declared officially the end of the Peace of Westphalia, replacing the respect of the UN Charter for Sovereignty with humanitarian interventions, which was followed by the right to protect, which was the idea that you can intervene in any country around the world. You just have to orchestrate the necessary lies to do so. as it happened in the case of Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and Yemen, which is a similar case. So this policy, which has cost millions of lives of people of the war-affected countries, and President Trump said many times these wars cost $7 trillion, and that's why he wants to end it. This should not continue. The Washington Post was then nitpicking, saying, no, it was only 4 trillion or 6 trillion, but not 7. But, this is what is at stake, when Trump says he wants to establish an order of peace with Russia and China, this is what the British forces are trying to prevent, and why the forces of the British Empire are out to get him. Because once Trump would succeed to establish such a relationship with Russia and China, it would end for good the ability of the British Empire to keep the geopolitical manipulation of the world. Okay, so this is one situation, but what most Americans have no idea of, because how could they when the mainstream media is completely not mentioning it once, that there is already something completely different, a different world emerging, namely the new paradigm of the new Silk Road dynamic. Now, ever since Xi Jinping announced the new Silk Road in Kazakhstan in 2013, 5 years have passed, and you have seen the most unbelievable transformation of Latin America, of Asia, of parts of Europe, of Africa, where many of the countries who are working with China, it's about 80 to 100 countries and international large organizations, who are working together in a win-win cooperation. They have developed in the last 5 years major development corridors connecting China and Europe, within Asia. Basically, many cargo trains of goods are being exchanged. Africa has completely changed. There were Chinese investments altogether of $5 trillion in the last 5 years. So what has developed is a completely new system of international relations based on sovereignty, based on the respect for the other social system, non-interference, and more and more countries are joining that. So what you have seen in the last months is that the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have joined with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union. At the recent BRICS conference in South Africa, you had a formation of something called the Global South, which is practically the entire third world, or what used to be called the third world. It's the G77, it's Mercosur, it's the Organization of Islamic Countries, it's the African Union, and many regional organizations, all agreeing that they will build a new system of international relations. Now, Xi Jinping at that summit in Johannesburg basically said a beautiful thing, namely that science and technology is giving humanity an inexhaustible force to improve its condition, an inexhaustible source. And he said that because Africa has the most developing countries, the African continent has the largest development potential of anybody. And Putin at the same summit said that Russia will help to lift Africa up by bringing power to the 600 million people who still have no access to electricity, by not only providing gas and oil, but by helping the African countries to build up nuclear power for all of them. So therefore, what happened in the last months between the BRICS conference in South Africa and then this historic conference, the FOCAC meeting at the beginning of September in Beijing, where 53 heads of state, mostly presidents and the rest were 5 prime ministers, participated in this conference, which I really think established the official end of colonialism, because it has given the African nations a completely different sense of empowerment, because China is offering them not only infrastructure investment, scientific and technological transfer, but to offer them a strategy of leapfrogging, whereby African countries and other developing countries can have access to the most advanced science and technology, to not just repeat all the levels of development of the West, but to leapfrog to the highest level of science and technology. What Xi Jinping said at this conference is that China and Africa walk together towards prosperity. We think with one mind and we work with one heart. China pledged 60 billion for projects to be invested in Africa in the next 3 years. And he also declared this is open to all nations, to the United States, to the Europeans, to Japan, to anybody who wants to participate. So what is happening is that they are synergizing the Belt and Road Initiative of China, which is already a global network of infrastructure, realizing what the Schiller Institute put out in the 2 reports, the new Silk Route becomes the world land bridge, with the UN Agenda 2030, which is the idea that poverty will be eradicated on the entire planet. And China has, in the recent period, taken a leading role in pushing that agenda forward. And China has the plan to eliminate poverty in China altogether until 2020. Now, that's less than 2 years from now. And they are on a very good track to accomplish exactly that by, going. Xi Jinping went personally to the countryside, to the villages, had people look at each individual, each family, what is needed to improve their condition. And integrating this UN 2030 agenda with the African Union Agenda 2063, which is a very, very beautiful and ambitious program by the Africans to be fully modernized by 2063. They announced that 2013, and therefore it was a 50-year perspective to transform the African continent completely. Now, Xi Jinping said very clearly, the aim of all of this is to make the world more balanced and a better place for everyone to live in. Now, look at what the Africans say themselves. The South African President Ramaphosa said that China and Africa are entering a new golden age, a real fantastic age of deep cooperation based on the equality with deep respect for each other. He said the notion of neo-colonialism, which is being put on China, is propagated by people who envy us and who are jealous of our relationship. And I think that that is absolutely true. Ramaphosa, in the speech to the FOCAC conference in Beijing, said, Africa is independent now and is free to choose its partners. And China has been supportive and engaged in partnership where we try now to promote and assist each other. So this is a historic break. 500 years of colonialism, 50, 70 years of IMF conditionalities suppressing the development of Africa is over. And the artificial keeping Africa backward through the doctrines of physical economic stagnation, zero growth, and British-style free trade, which was imposed by the colonial powers on Africa, is over. Now, China is using today what Franklin D. Roosevelt called in his debate with Churchill, that you need 20th century methods and not 18th century methods. 18th century methods meaning looting, exploitation, slave trade, exploiting raw materials. 20th century methods means industrialization, increase the productivity of the labor power, increase the longevity, let everybody participate in the progress of science and technology, health, infrastructure, and so forth. So there is a new saying that Africa is becoming the new China, but the new China with African characteristics. So there were 37 heads of, China made a memo of understanding with 37 countries at this FOCAC meeting. This is a complete explosion of development. Then 1 week later, you have the Eurasian Economic Forum in Vladivostok. And this is a similar gigantic strategic realignment in the direction of development, with 6,000 participants from 60 nations, 3,000 Russians, 1,000 Chinese, many people from South Korea, North Korea, Japan. And what was discussed at this forum is that the far east of Russia and Siberia will become the new frontier of the East. Remember that this is one of the untapped resources of the world, because in the far east of Russia, you have all the elements of the Mendeleev table in large quantities. So if you have joint investment from North and South Korea, from Japan, from Russia and others, to develop this region, which the United States could easily participate in via the Bering Strait and connect to this Trans-Eurasian network, this means, a lot of prosperity for many people on the planet for the next decades. Very exciting was that at this summit, also between Putin and Prime Minister Abe of Japan, they announced that there will be a new peace treaty until the end of the year, ending the de facto state of not war, but no peace treaty between the two countries. And I'm planning very much to pick up on that, demanding a peace treaty between the United States and Germany, which I think is also very, very urgent. So what I want people to sort of grasp, that don't think the reality is what you see here inside the United States. You are living in a fishbowl. You are living in a completely artificial environment where the real issues going on in the world and determining the future of mankind, you do have no chance to know about it if you rely on the mass media. And if you don't know what you are looking for, even the internet doesn't help you, because the internet floods you with information, so you find all of these apps and messages and so forth. You have to know what you are looking for, which you can take my remarks as a guideline, and you will find the proof yourself. But there is a new system, a completely new paradigm of relations among nations developing. And Prime Minister Abe at this Vladivostok meeting said, we have to get rid of everything of the post-war period, and we need a completely new beginning. So naturally, everything I'm saying is contradicted by the mainstream media and the think tanks, who basically for about 4 years ignored all of this fantastic development, and all of a sudden they woke up and realized that this is all happening. So they started an unprecedented slander campaign against the new Silk Road, saying this is luring the third world countries into a debt trap. Now, nothing could be more true. China is forgiving many of the loans it gave, while the Western countries have caused a debt trap for many of the developing countries. Another argument is China is proceeding with neo-colonialism. Well, I'm sorry, if China is uplifting the living standard, is giving fair conditions of equal treatment, a win-win cooperation, this is the opposite of colonialism. Another argument, they are only deploying Chinese labor. There is no transparency. These projects are not profitable. it creates dependency of the third world. Well, I would advise people to read the official McKinsey report, who already last year absolutely said this is all to the benefit of these countries. They have, for the first time, a development chance. They are deploying 90% African labor, and only those positions which the Africans are not yet trained in are temporarily taken over by the Chinese. In Ethiopia, for example, China is now setting up a new academy for people to learn how to run sophisticated fast railways, giving their knowledge basically to many millions of other people. So then the Kinsey report also stated that all of these projects are not following a big master plan where the Chinese communist government would control every investment, but that all of these investments basically follow market rules. And McKinsey is not exactly your communist propaganda outfit. Now, what is really at stake here is the image of man. China says, Xi Jinping says, the African continent has the biggest development potential of all because they need the most development. Africa will have, by the year 2050, 2.5 billion people. That means, you will have a lot of young people. Africa will be the youngest continent of all, which, if the young people of Africa are being educated, means they will be the most prosperous. So this is in complete contrast to the image of men, for example, given by an author called Stephen Smith, who is a lecturer at Duke University here in the United States, and who wrote an absolutely horrific book, which is being quoted everywhere right now in the Western media. The title of this book is called Eurafrica, the young continent comes to the old continent, referring to the migrant crisis in Europe, saying that the Chinese investments in Africa are terrible because they are the reason for the migrant crisis, because they allow the Africans to have a certain living standard so that then they have the means to go in the Mediterranean and drown and come to the European continent. It's completely crazy, but this is being quoted everywhere. And if you look at the language in this book, it is the old, Rockefeller mantra, overpopulation, use surplus, excess use, all completely words which are completely cynical against human beings, as if human beings would be some kind of a parasite and you have too many of them. So it is quite incredible. So what, on the other side, China and Africans are emphasizing is that what unites them is a deep friendship. Now, remember that Winston Churchill said this is completely impossible because between countries you can't have friendship, you only have interest. And naturally, if you have a neoliberal, neocon establishment, then that is obviously true. But if you reach out and have a people-to-people understanding, if you respect the beautiful other culture of the other country, you can develop love. You can develop friendship because you realize that God has made the world so multiple, beautiful, that once you know all of these other cultures, you are enriched. So Xi Jinping says the aim of all of this is happiness for all. Now just imagine just think that the geopolitical faction, because they are used to think in terms of geopolitics, it's either the US interest or the European Union interest against China, against Russia, in Europe, in the meantime, against the United States. Then if you have these geopolitical spectacles, naturally you think that that is the only way, and you cannot imagine that mankind is capable of creating a completely different system of human relations. So one example to look at the difference in thinking, and I thought this was one of the most beautiful attempts to chances to see the difference in the thinking was the answer Xi Jinping gave recently in response to a letter of 8 professors of the Academy of Fine Arts in China, where these professors asked him, how much significance do you give to the question of the aesthetical education? And Xi Jinping said that the aesthetical education in the training of students has the highest importance, the training in great classical arts, because the goal of this aesthetical education is to create beautiful minds. Now, that happens to be one of the absolute aims of the Schiller Institute in the tradition of Friedrich Schiller, that we want people to develop beautiful souls. And for Schiller, beautiful soul and mind is very much the same. Now, think about how the youth in America is being treated. The drug epidemic, the suicide rate, the despair, the non-idea of a future. And you could not see more clearly, what is really the problem. And, I think President Trump knows this and has already said he wants to get rid of this drug epidemic. But, the present battles he is involved in have made it very difficult for him to do that. So look at the changes in the world. You have Russia and China in a strategic alliance, and at this Vladivostok summit, they will deepen their regional cooperation according to the Volga-Yangtze mechanism. At the same time, Russia has, together with China, the largest maneuver in the Far East. So you see the two potentials. It's very clear Russia and China are building a new world, but they're also making very clear they're not going to be pushed over. They're not going to start a war, but they also make very clear they know how to defend themselves. So I think people in the West have to make up their minds. Either we in the West, the United States, in Europe, we join the new paradigm, or we go in the direction of confrontation, which, if it would escalate, in all likelihood would mean the annihilation of civilization. And that is really the issue at the midterm election. It's not what people think, this or that. It is this. And I fully agree with Willy Wimmer that what stands between World War III and all of us is Donald Trump. If he's driven out of office one way or another, I would not give 2 pennies worth for world peace. Because if you look at the hysteria with which the certain Democrats who used to be reasonable in the past, who have gone completely mad. One example for me is Robert Reich, who, when he was Labor Secretary in the Clinton administration, used to say sometimes quite decent things on economics. But he wrote recently an editorial where he said, we have to annihilate Trump. This election should be annihilated from the memory of history. It should never have happened. You don't talk like that unless you are possessed and driven. And many of these people, have said similar things. So there is one other danger, and that is that 10 years after the financial crash of 2008, we are again at a point of a potential explosion of the monetary system on a much larger scale. The former chief economist of the Bank of International Settlement, William White, who is a quite good economist, we have studied his works for quite some time, he just came out and said, that since there was no of the causes removed from 2008, you could have a financial blowout any moment. Jean-Claude Trichet, who is the former president of the European Central Bank between 2003 and 2011, just said the same thing. He said the danger is of a blowout, and many others, warning even that such a financial blowout could occur way before the midterm election in the United States. Now, naturally, if this would happen, you could end up in chaos, and out of chaos would come war. Naturally, what Trichet is prescribing as a remedy is more of the poison he has spread when he was in his position, namely more structural reforms, more austerity, more reduction of wages and similar things. But, there is actually a solution. And we are now at the point where Mr. LaRouche, who warned on the 25th of September in 2007, 1 week before the secondary mortgage crisis in the United States broke out, he said in a video, which you can see on the internet, this financial system is hopelessly bankrupt, and nothing in the world can be done to undo that unless you completely reform it and go for Glass-Steagall, go for a new Bretton Woods system. And he said, all what we see now will be just the different aspects of this bankrupt system coming to the surface, which then happened in 2007 with the mortgage crisis, in 2008 with Lehman Brothers. And since the central banks did absolutely nothing to remedy that, we have now a situation where the corporate debt, the indebtedness in general, the reversed carry trade, where when the Federal Reserve tried to increase the interest rate just a little bit, the currencies of the emerging countries started to fall practically without a bottom. So you have all this minefield which could lead to a complete explosion in the next weeks. Now, China is aware of that. They have for some times demanded a new financial international governance. And they have introduced a law forbidding speculation and actually forbidding Chinese investors to involve themselves in international speculative activity. So this is one of the various things one has to consider, that in the light of the US trade war against China, the US sanctions against Russia, the secondary sanctions against Europeans who are affected by these sanctions and others, are discussing to replace the dollar as a world leading currency and go into trade in their national currencies, using the Turkish lira, the Russian ruble, the Chinese yuan, renminbi, and this is already happening in many parts of the world. The problem is it does not work, because if you do not include the United States in a solution of this problem, all these beautiful efforts by other countries to establish different relations may not work. Because if you have chaos in the transatlantic financial system, I do not think that the United States would agree to its own demise in the same peaceful way like the Soviet Union eventually disintegrated in '91. I think that the potential for the United States to go both in a civil war, and this is what many European analysts have warned in the recent period, that given the incredible degree of weaponry in the country, automatic rifles, that the danger under conditions of a breakdown chaos, you could have civil war in the United States at the same time with a large war erupting on a global scale. Now, this is why the only way, and this has been said by my husband many years ago, is to have a new Bretton Woods. To go back to where Nixon went on the wrong way on the 15th of August 1971, when he decoupled the dollar from the gold, dissolved the fixed exchange rate systems, which was really the beginning of this absolutely excessive deregulation of the markets, leading to the present, casino economy. So you have to go back to that point, go back to a fixed exchange rate system, but you have to improve it, which is why it has to be called New Bretton Woods, because while Franklin D. Roosevelt had one intention, namely to use 20th century methods to end colonialism in the developing countries, under Truman, the Bretton Woods system was very much influenced already by Churchill, and this is why when you talk about New Bretton Woods, many people in Africa and other countries say, oh no, we don't want that because it put us so much at a disadvantage, which is why we are saying a new Bretton Woods, because you need to have a kind of return to a system where it is not the maximum profit of the speculators, but the common good of the people, which must be the purpose of economy. Now, my husband has said many times, and if you think about it, it is absolutely makes absolutely sense, that in order to get rid of the power which rules the West right now, the City of London, the Wall Street, who are really, also behind these war provocations and behind many other things, the only way how you can outweigh them is by a four-power agreement. You need a combination of the United States, Russia, China, and India, possibly with Japan, with an open invitation to all other nations of the world. But you need a core combination which is powerful enough that they can replace the system of the British Empire with an international credit system based on the American system of economy of Alexander Hamilton. This combination must implement a global Glass-Steagall, start with a banking separation, then create a national bank in each country, give the power of credit generation back to the sovereign states at government, issue credit for investment in the physical economy, and set up a global system based on the commitment for sovereign credit cooperation among sovereign nations. A new Bretton Woods system, which, as intended by FDR, would basically develop the developing countries not with 20th century methods, but with 21st century methods, by allowing these countries to leapfrog to a level of complete development by increasing their productivity, living standard, longevity, and allow them to participate in the fruits of science and technology on the highest level. Now, people say this is utopian, this cannot happen. But that's not true. The framework for this already exists in the form of the Belt and Road Initiative, becoming the World Land Bridge. There is already this global cooperation network that connects continents through corridors, tunnels, bridges, by air, by land, by sea. And obviously, it started already with building infrastructure, of which the world suffers tremendously of. There is a tremendous lack of infrastructure, not only in the developing countries, but also in the West. And I would, having come this morning from New Jersey to New York, I would emphatically say, especially in the United States, I don't know, frankly, how you do this, I mean, how can you travel in these roads which have potholes? If you have a back problem, every 2 meters you have a shock effect in your bones. But also people are rageful, it's dangerous. 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the evening, in some cases even more. I mean, this is irrational to the hilt. It's completely crazy. And I don't understand why people don't make a riot about it and say, we don't want this. This is cheating us for our life. If you compare that, for example, with the fast train system in China, I mean, if you have ever any touristic plans, go to China, travel with a fast train system. They go by now 320, 30 kilometers is about 250 miles. They are smooth, they fly through the landscape, they are quiet, they don't shake, because they're built very well. And then they are now building a fast train between every major city in China. It will go from Shanghai to Beijing, you just need a little bit less than 5 hours. To Nanjing, 4 hours. They are now taking an area of the size of New York and New Jersey, namely the triangle between Beijing, Tianjin, and Hebei province. And they are revamping the whole thing, putting in fast train for the inner city transport, slow maglev trains, which only go 150 kilometers, which can stop very quickly. The beautiful thing about the maglev is they have a extreme quick acceleration, so you can go in 10 seconds to full speed, and you're not falling back, you're not falling back behind the seat, because the technology is such, it takes off, and you are right there and you can stop again. So for inner city traffic, this is absolutely perfect. Now, obviously, this is what we need here. I think, what you need is a transport system in the United States which connects Philadelphia, Boston, New York, Chicago, Detroit, the West Coast, Texas, through a network of fast train systems. I mean, this street system is absolutely outmoded. America has 250 kilometers fast train. Somewhere between New York and Boston, it's, I think, a little strip of 200 kilometers where you go 250 kilometers. That's all. So you have nothing. So you should get one, So obviously, the difference is, infrastructure investment cannot be done by private interest, because the private interest wants to have toll booths. You have to pay for the Lincoln Tunnel $15, then you pay for another strip $8. There are now places on the Beltway around Washington where at certain hours of the day you pay for a few miles $40. I mean, this is insane. Now, what this means is that obviously not everybody can afford that. So then many cars go off the highway, go to the little streets, which become congested, and it's completely suffocating the real economy. So the toll system is another one of these insane things, because infrastructure as such is not supposed to bring profit, but it's supposed to be the framework and environment for industry to blossom. So this is where we have to really get a mobilization, because, I think President Trump probably intends the right thing by imposing tariffs on certain categories of industry, like steel, aluminum, and other things. And I think he has a right impulse that he wants to undo the mistakes of previous administrations who have outsourced production to cheap labor markets. But it is not the right thing. I mean, I try to, defend Trump, and I'm probably one of two people in Germany who even dare to talk about the importance of Trump not losing the election. But I think here he's really wrong, because if you want to have a four-power agreement, and if you want to have friendship between the United States, Russia, China, India, and other countries, you cannot start a trade war. And I've talked to all Chinese contacts, or many in the recent period, and they're all extremely upset, saying this is hurting everybody. It's hurting the US consumers who have to pay for the increased prices. It is not leading to the kind of technological innovation in new industries in the United States, and it is just punitive. It's being perceived as punitive tariffs against high technology areas to stop the China 2021. And this is causing a big blood, and it pertains to the Thucydides trap, to the question, does the United States allow the rise of China, or will a new world war come out of it? And that's how many people in China look at that. And there is, in my view, a much better way of doing it, namely with the four-power agreement to set up this new Bretton Woods system, to create a new credit mechanism, and then have Chinese investing in the infrastructure in the United States. China has about 1 trillion US Treasury reserves, and the offer by China has been, by Li Keqiang, that China could use these treasuries to invest in infrastructure in the United States and offer joint ventures in other countries, increase the cake, and by increasing trade, get rid of the balance that way. Now, obviously, this is not liked by some people, but it is the rational solution. Now, is it possible to get such an agreement? what people also don't consider is that the Chinese economic model is very much close to the American system of economy. And basically, if you look at Friedrich List was the collaborator of the Careys. He spent several years in the United States, and he wrote many works about the difference between the American and the English system of economy. So it happens to be that he right now is, according to the FAZ in 2011 and many other reports, the most popular economist theoretician in China. The American journalist and author Chalmer Johnson noted the fact that List has much more influence in Asia than either Adam Smith or Karl Marx. And the China model can actually be called a neo-Hamiltonian or neo-Listian model with Chinese characteristics. Now, if the President of the United States, who said he likes the American system of economy and he plans to implement Glass-Steagall, basically would agree to participate, the United States could engage in investment in high-tech exports in the countries of the Belt and Road Initiative. And even if these exports would not always bring the biggest profit, it would lead to fostering the increased rates of turnover of the most advanced capital goods sector of production inside the United States, causing a continuous wave of innovation, and that way increasing the productivity of the US economy. So as a byproduct of such exports, the rate of innovation and improvement of technology in the United States would increase, so that basically the productive power of labor would increase, and by increasing the production of capital goods for export, the US would rapidly reverse the effects of outsourcing of production and deindustrialization. And since the fastest rates of growth can be found in space, research, and exploration, and joint space travel is the joint future mission of humanity, we should concentrate on the development of Moon and Mars and to unite us as humanity in this way. So we have to change the way we think. Don't think from inside the box. If you look at German politics from inside Germany, you think you are in an insane asylum. Because people say, this is my position against your position, and they debate totally meaningless issues. And I hate to tell you, in the United States, it looks pretty much the same way. Think how humanity should look like in 100 years from now. Today's vision of sending astronauts to the Moon and Mars will soon be realized. It's not a question of if, but a question of when. So let's concentrate on questions like, how can we create conditions to live on the ISS, to live in villages on the Moon, and then eventually on Mars? We should think of today, of us in the present, from the standpoint of Schiller's universal history. How would we like to be looked at from the standpoint of our grandchildren and great-grandchildren? Are we that force, that generation which initiated and contributed to the transformation of the world into a new paradigm, which ended colonization and which got mankind's history into the idea of the one humanity? Coming back to the idea of the punctum saliens in history, that jumping point, that point of decision where all the moral potential is called forth to change this fate, to not end up in a tragedy, but to create a new, more beautiful period of human civilization. This is what is presently our situation. So let's, in this sense, work from the standpoint of the new Silk Road spirit to become truly human, and let that, in the sense of Percy Shelley, become the true spirit of the age. Thank you.
in November of 2017, the Schiller Institute released the report extending the New Silk Road to West Asia and Africa, a vision of an economic renaissance. One of the authors of the report, Jason Ross, is now going to address us, and he tells me that the title of his speech is Expanding Possibility. So we'll leave it at that. Jason?
All right. Good. Well, good afternoon. Very happy to be here with everybody. Thank you for making the very wise choice of coming to today's conference, choosing to spend your day with us here today. What I want to talk about today is, as the title says, expanding possibility. And what that means is, let's talk for just a minute to think about what is the human species capable of doing. What is possible for us, and what determines, what shapes what is possible for us. So if we look over the time of human civilization, what was possible for the human species to do has changed dramatically over the years. Today, if you're fortunate enough to live, for example, in China, it's possible to take a high-speed train and go somewhere. 200 years ago, it was not possible anywhere on the planet to microwave some popcorn for a snack. Didn't exist. So what's the source of economic wealth? What is it that changes what we're capable of doing as a species? It's the unique power of the human mind to discover principles about how the universe functions, and then apply that knowledge to transform our relationship to nature. Unlike any animal species, unlike any plant, unlike moss, our relationship to nature is one that we define, that we change. We do not have a carrying capacity that is fixed. The number of people that can live on this planet depends on what kind of people we are, what kind of people we choose to be, what kind of discoveries that we choose to make. And the basis of Lyndon LaRouche's discoveries in economics came from him recognizing a deeper insight into the relationship between technological progress, scientific discovery, and improvements in the productive powers of labor. How does knowledge translate into the potential for greater economic value? How does knowledge translate into better living standards and, most importantly, the potential for an improved culture where more people are able to participate in that development process as a whole? Now, what I want to do today in particular on that is to focus on some of the recent developments that took place in China, specifically China and African relations. And I'd like to actually set that up by talking a bit about Africa's expressed desires for its own development. People speak on behalf of each other frequently on this planet, so I'm going to use some quotes here so we can hear very directly from the African Union. This is the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, considered by many to be the capital of Africa. And as was just mentioned, in 2013, the African Union set out a plan for what the next 50 years ought to be like. In 2013 was announced Agenda 2063. 50 years from 2013 and 100 years from the formation of the Organization for African Unity, which was founded in 1963. So 100 years after the OAU's founding, 2063, what will the world look like? And this is what the plan is, Agenda 2063. Let's take a look at a few of the highlights of this proposal. There are about a dozen flagship projects. I'll list a few of them. One, an integrated high-speed rail network. Every capital city of Africa, continental Africa, connected by a high-speed rail. The African Commodities Strategy. This calls for increasing exports, increasing trade within Africa. For example, right now, if you added up the imports of all African nations, only 12% of those imports come from other African nations. 88% are coming from countries outside the continent. The goal is to get that up to 50% in the next 2 decades. Freedom of movement, ending all wars, the Grand Inga Dam, cooperation on outer space, on education. Just to say a little bit about 2 of those in particular, this is the Trans-African Highway Network proposed by the African Union. This shows us the site of the Grand Inga Dam. The large country you see in the middle there on the left is the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has one of the lowest levels of electricity use in the world. The average electricity use per person in the DRC is 10 watts. So if you think about how much light you get for 10 watts, for example, that's the average per person. Very, very low. This Grand Inga Dam is capable of providing 40,000 megawatts of electricity in one dam location. This is enough for millions of people at a high industrial level. This is an enormously important project. And it's one that the World Bank has pulled out on based on environmental troubles that it would cause, is the claim. Apparently people forget that human beings are part of the environment too. Human beings count too, don't we? So let's talk a little bit more about what's in the full Agenda 2063. Here's one of them. Actually, I'll read 2 others. We are determined to eradicate poverty in 1 generation and build shared prosperity through social and economic transformation of the continent. We will have world-class integrative infrastructure that crisscrosses the continent. By 2063, the necessary infrastructure will be in place to support Africa's integrated growth, technological transformation, and trade development. This will include high-speed railway networks, roads, shipping lines, sea and air transport, as well as well-developed information and digital economy. Intra-African trade will grow from less than 12% in 2013 to approaching 50% by 2045. Africa's share of global trade will grow from 2% to 12%. Africa will be free of armed conflict, of terrorism, extremism, intolerance, and gender-based violence. The continent will be drugs-free, with no human trafficking, and organized crime and criminal networks ended. Young African men and women will be the path breakers of the African Knowledge Society and will contribute significantly to innovation. The creativity, energy, and innovation of Africa's youth shall be the driving force behind the continent's political, social, cultural, and economic transformation. Africa shall continue to advocate for the reform of the United Nations and other international institutions, with particular reference to the UN Security Council, in order to correct the historical injustice of Africa not being represented on the Council by a permanent seat. Completely eliminate hunger and food insecurity, reduce imports of food, and raise intra-African trade and agriculture to 50% of the total. And we call upon the international community to respect Africa's vision and aspirations and to align their partnerships appropriately. So this is the official document adopted unanimously by the African Union, which encompasses every nation of Africa. This is the official policy stance adopted in 2013. As part of that, the chairwoman of the African Union at the time, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, she wrote an email from the future, writing to a friend in 2063. She writes towards the end, "Let me conclude this email with some family news. The twins, after completing their space studies at Bahir Dar University, decided to take the month before they start work at the African Space Agency to travel the continent. My friend, in our days, trying to do that in 1 month would have been impossible. But the African Express Rail now connects the capitals of our former states, and indeed, they will be able to crisscross and see the beauty, culture, and diversity of this cradle of mankind. The marvel of the African Rail Express is not only that it is a high-speed train with adjacent highways, but it also contains pipelines for gas, oil, and water, as well as broadband cables. African ownership, integrated planning, and execution at its best. She goes on to say that in 2063, the Confederation of African States celebrated 20 years since taking its seat as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and is a major force for global stability, peace, human rights, progress, tolerance, and justice. I end this email and look forward to seeing you in February, she writes. I will bring along some of the chocolates from Accra that you so love and which our children can now afford. Till we meet again, Nkosazana. Anybody know what country Accra is in? So Ghana is known as being famous for its chocolate. How much of that chocolate is processed in Ghana presently? Why is Belgium famous for chocolate? Is chocolate grown in Belgium? Okay. So I'm not going to say any more weighing in on this. I just want to put that on the table. This is Agenda 2063. This is the African Union's vision for the future. And from that standpoint, let's look at the relationship of other nations to this African Union vision. So I want to specifically look at what just occurred September 3rd and 4th in Beijing at the FOCAC meeting, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. This was founded in the year 2000, and every 3 years, the countries of the African Union and China get together and they rotate where they meet. In 2015, it was in South Africa. 2018, this year, it was in Beijing. 2021, Senegal is the president and will be hosting the next FOCAC meeting in Senegal. Let me read a little bit from the declaration that came from this event, which, as has been mentioned, was attended, of course, by President Xi Jinping. All 53 AU countries that have diplomatic ties with China attended, and almost all were represented by their president, prime minister, king, or other head of state. So let me read part of this declaration from Beijing. We agree that China and Africa have always been a community of destiny. China is the largest developing country, and Africa is the continent with the largest concentration of developing countries. Based on common historical encounters, development tasks, and political demands, the Chinese and African people have a deep friendship with the same breadth and common destiny. Point 4.2. Africa is a historical and natural extension of the Belt and Road and an important participant. China-Africa joint construction of the Belt and Road will provide more resources and means for African development, expand a broader market, and provide more diversified development. We unanimously agree to closely link the Belt and Road with the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the African Union's Agenda 2063. One more. A promise to continue to firmly adhere to the One China principle. Some politics as well. And we advocate the necessary reforms of the United Nations, including the Security Council, to better fulfill the responsibilities entrusted to it by the UN Charter and enhance the UN's ability to respond to global threats and challenges. The historical injustice suffered by African countries should be corrected, and representatives of African countries in the UN Security Council and other institutions should be given priority to jointly promote the reform of international governance. We also advocate reforms in international financial institutions, including the Bretton Woods institutions. So here's China very explicitly supporting the what was called for, you heard it just there, in Agenda 2063. So how has the West, how has part of the West, particularly the British, who have a certain history with Africa themselves, how have they responded to what China has been doing in Africa? Has anybody read any news about China's involvement in Africa? Any words come to mind? Shout them out. Anything that you've seen in an article? Debt trap, colonialism. Okay. New colonialism. I think people completely forgot what happened in the old colonialism to even possibly use that as a comparison. It's disgusting to even make that comparison. Yeah, so is China making a debt trap? The Economist, which always has everyone's best interests in mind. The perils of China's debt trap diplomacy. The Washington Post, China's debt trap around the world are a trademark of its imperialist ambitions. The New York Times, how China got Sri Lanka to cough up a port. So is this true? Well, let's take a look and let's hear from some people around the world on this, including someone that's rarely heard from in the New York Times, people in Africa. Imagine. So let me start with this. This is a US organization. This is the China-Africa Research Initiative. It's definitely the best in the US on studying this. Right before the FOCAC, you can see what's highlighted there, their official briefing paper. We find that Chinese loans are not currently a major contributor to debt distress in Africa. This is a chart that was recently published in an article by Jude Moore, the former Minister of Public Works of Liberia. And I'm not sure if you can read these numbers. This is the amount of debt, of African debt, and who holds it. I don't know if you can read the legend there. Can anybody guess what color the red is? Is that China? Is that China's debt trap? I don't know if you can read it. The blue is China, okay? The blue is the amount of African debt held by China. Is that a debt trap? It's not a debt trap. Here's what Jude Moore had to say. The red is, well, the yellow is private loans outside of China. Red is official loans outside of China. So that would be the IMF, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, other institutions like that. A lot of it's the IMF. So here's Jude Moore. He says, it's almost as if African countries are naive or they don't understand what's happening to them, and China is pulling the wool over their eyes. That's what he said it sounds like reading the New York Times. This almost infantilizes Africans and African leaders. To treat African leaders as though they were just snookered or fooled by China. These projects that have taken place, like the standard gauge rail in Kenya, the Djibouti-Addis Ababa Railroad, these are projects that countries wanted to build, were looking for financing, and then they got it from China. Okay? There are development goals that already exist, and people shouldn't pretend as though, it's very insulting. It's often presented as though African leaders or countries have no ideas, and anyway, well, you can hear it straight from him, so I won't say any more about that. He also said about Sri Lanka, he said, everyone brings up the port in Sri Lanka, but China has given out billions of dollars in debt and financing. And in my view, the fact that the port in Sri Lanka is the only example that people can give, that shows that this Sri Lanka example, this one instance, cannot be considered the be-all and end-all about how China engages its partners. This looks like someone who's pretty important. The president of Nigeria, the most populous country in Africa. Well, what does he say? He says, let me use this opportunity to address and dispel insinuations about a so-called Chinese debt trap. These vital infrastructure projects are perfectly in line with Nigeria's economic recovery and growth plan. Nigeria is fully able to repay all the loans as and when due, in keeping with our policy of fiscal prudence and sound housekeeping. One more, the president of the African Development Bank. Let me be very clear, he says, Africa has absolutely no debt crisis. I think maybe that's enough quotes at this point to make something a little bit clear about that. Let me shift to briefly talk about what development means, specific development goals, and how LaRouche's economic method comes to bear in this. So let's think about this. First off, let's get a sense, sticking with Africa for a little bit, just the size of the continent. Maps are incorrect, as people know, compared to a globe, and you can't make a map that's perfect. You could make a map that's far more perfect than the ones we typically use, because people don't generally get the sense that you can fit China. Can people see the different colored shapes here? What's the purple shape in the upper left? United States. How about the big red thing in the bottom? Okay, orange on the right? Green in the middle? Mexico. Okay. There's Sweden, same size as Madagascar. So this is pretty big, all right? In terms of population, it's a little bit different, right? So here we can see China fits within Africa. Here the different countries or continents, as the case may be, are scaled by their size in terms of population. China, 1.4 billion. Africa, 1.2 billion. US, 0.3 billion. There's England down there, which has a seat on the UN Security Council. It hardly represents anybody on the planet. Let's look at energy. Total energy use. So China uses a similar amount of energy as the US. It uses more, but with 4 times as many people. Look at Africa. What's the value of energy infrastructure in Africa? Is it the value going to be that some private investor says, I'm going to set up a power plant and make money charging people for electricity? Is that the full value of having electricity in an economy? Here we have per person energy use, electricity use. Okay. A lot of room to grow. So, what is the role of science and technology in economic growth? Let's take a minute and look at a couple of pictures of this. Here we've got the Earth at night. And I think it's, everyone can make certain observations here. What is the light corresponds to lights being on at night. What else do you think it corresponds to? Power? Mm-hmm. Population centers, yes. So let's take a look. Can you identify on the map where North and South Korea are? Whoops. Right over here, okay? Here's South Korea. There's North Korea right above it. Does this mean there's no people in North Korea? Okay. It's a measure of development. It's a measure of development. So how are we going to make this kind of transformation? One thing, let me just say one thing about energy. You cannot have modern economic development without energy. You can't have industry and manufacturing without energy. You can't have technology and communications without energy, without electricity specifically. Here's the only example I'm going to use on energy. On the left, and especially if you haven't seen this presentation slide before, does anybody know what that molecule is on the left? Methane, okay? And you can see on the bottom there the amount of energy that comes in the combustion of one molecule of methane, 8 electron volts. On the right, does anyone know the name of the process occurring on the right? Fusion, right. We've got deuterium and tritium combining. The total amount of energy, see the numbers down here, 14.1 MeV, 3.5 MeV. Anybody remember from science class what M stands for? Million, but mega, which means a million. So in one fusion reaction, there's 2 million times as much power as one chemical reaction. There's just a limit to what the human species can do. There's a limit to our possibility if we're using chemical energy. There's an even lower limit if we're not even using chemical energy, if we go back to just using the sun and the wind. Okay? Windmills were a great invention centuries ago. They're not anymore. This is what we're going to be looking back at 50 years from now and saying, the development of fusion was one of those signal moments in human history that completely transformed what our species could do. It'll be like going to the moon. It'll be looked at that way. Making a solar panel 20% more efficient, no one is going to look back at that in 50 years and say that was what made the difference. No one is going to say that. It won't happen because it's not true. So let me finish with quoting from a paper written by Lyndon LaRouche about what economic value creation is. This is from a paper he wrote some decades ago. Dr. Karl Marx refuted. He writes, "The great work of the soul is to transmit to present and future souls an increase of the potential for accomplishing the work of the soul, as we today have received such increase of our own powers from the work of souls over countless generations who have gone before us. What is the work of the soul? Anybody have an idea of what the work of the soul is in regards to economy? Human creativity. That sounds like a good guess. Let's see what he says about this. So the true work of the soul, in its most profound feature, becomes a work of love, a lovingness in shared endeavor, which unites us soul with the souls of past, present, and future, with the divine and past, present, and future generations of our species. The material benefits of this process are indispensable to existence of our species, and to raise the level of material culture in such a way that our dependency on beast-like powers for labor is reduced, in favor of a shift towards control over nature by means of our minds, by means of the creative powers of discovery, which are the activity of the soul. Labor, so directed in its self-transformation, serves as the indispensable mediation of that work of the soul, although it is only that mediation. This limitless task, this work of the soul, passed lovingly from generation to generation, is our true self-interest as individual persons. The self-interest of our species as a whole, and our immediate self-interest as individual members of that species are directly one and the same. Now, LaRouche has put that view into practice. I'd like to conclude by saying a small bit about that. This is a proposal from the Fusion Energy Foundation in the 1970s on the industrialization of Africa. Here is LaRouche lecturing on his economics. Over the course of the 90s, with the development of what was eventually put forward as the Eurasian Land Bridge, in a report that came out just shortly after our keynote speaker, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, presented these concepts herself in Beijing. More on Africa itself is found in the report that Dennis had held up just a few minutes ago. And then I just want to make sure everybody is aware of the Schiller Institute's pulling together of this view in The New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge, a shared future for humanity. This is a full proposal for development around the world, but it goes far beyond that. The strategic outlook necessary to achieve it, the cultural requirements for ongoing advancement of thought, and the economic approach that, if implemented, can give us the greatest economic expansion we've ever seen in the history of the human race, and along with it, the greatest advancement in people's ability in expanding the realm of the number of people on this planet able themselves personally to knowingly participate in the development of the species as a whole. This is the greatest gift that we can give to the future. The knowledge to young people that they are needed, that there is a mission, and that they'll be able to look back on their lives with satisfaction as having done something of enduring value for the necessary advancement of the species as a whole.
Question. Can we take a question?